Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 4th of April 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Thanks to JR who has done the mapping again. It's just every day's a busy day for me, and so I really appreciate the help. Thanks, mate. Okay. We can see that yet again no changes have been made to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, and that is very significant. I think always good news when there's no news. No news is definitely good news. No changes in the Terny-Torska salient, even though there have been many claims of some pretty costly attacks from the Russians there. Those costly attacks don't even seem to have pushed the Russian lines to the west. The ISW Institute for the Study of War says geolocated footage published on the 3rd shows Ukrainian forces repelling a roughly reinforced platoon-sized Russian mechanized assault east of Terny, and that's what I've shown you previously, with first-person view drones, artillery, and anti-tank guided missiles. It is unclear when Russian forces conducted this assault, but it's likely very recent. The recent roughly reinforced platoon-sized mechanized assault near there suggests that the Russians' command is prioritizing the Lyman direction and may further intensify the tempo of their offensive operations in the area. So that's to say that this whole Lyman direction, where you've got that town, I don't know, it seems so long ago, but if you remember, it was pretty much operationally encircled, and then the Russians pulled out during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and the Ukrainians took it back. Well, that direction is where the Russians are moving, but the idea that they actually put a large number of vehicles into an attack in this area shows that this is one of their key points of attack. Surat Maps says of the area's situation on a northeastern front. Video footage showing the Russian army shelling Ukrainian positions in Spirnash. It's a little bit further to the south. Sorry, I'll join that later. We'll go back to the ISW. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces conducted a glide bomb strike on the Ukrainian command post in Borova. That's interesting because that's quite some way back, although it's obviously within glide bomb range. That is, if you remember back some time when the Russians were attacking around this Novoherivka area, Nadia, Sahivka, Novoherivka, and they did get some fairly sizable gains in control. Indeed, there's a big difference between what Surat Maps thinks and the pro-Ukrainian mappers think in the area. But the idea was that they were pushing towards this town of Borova. The idea that they would actually take that, get that far, obviously that history shows that they were biting off more than they could chew. Nonetheless, they are hitting Borova with guided glide bombs, and they can release them fairly easily. Further back from the front line, they could, as long as you can get a plane to around the Starobilsk area, you can hit Borova, and that's what they appear to have done. And there's also talk about a bit of amplification from the Russians concerning footage purporting to show Russian forces striking a bridge across the Oskil River near the Kupiansk Vuzlovy. And Russian forces damaged bridges across the Oskil River in a coordinated strike campaign in September and October of last year, and they may be targeting crossings again in an effort to isolate the battle space on the east bank of the Oskil River. So you've got the Oskil River coming up here to Kupiansk, and the Russians were particularly up in this area hitting bridges around Kupiansk in order to try and cut off the Ukrainian logistics and their ability to supply their lines and whatnot. But I don't know if that's a sign of things to come or whether that's just general activity to try and stop the Ukrainians from being so effective in the area, rather than actually deciding to attack there at some point. And then we come to this Sperna area. So we have some changes for the mapping in terms of what's going on around. This is quite interesting here because it looks like the filtration plant around Sperna. So this is Sperna. It looks like the Ukrainians the Russians might not be in control of that. This was taken over some time ago. There's underground tunnels and whatnot there. But the fact that there's a change from Surat Maps that's very different to what Andrew Perpetual and Deep State Maps has in favour of the Russians here is quite significant. Surat Map says, situation northeastern front, video footage showing Russian army shelling Ukrainian army positions in Spirna allowed me to correct the map. The locality is again under full control of the Ukrainian army. The video is several days old, possibly the end of March. However, it seems to corroborate an earlier video from February indicating that the gas station and warehouses in the south were recaptured by the Ukrainian forces at the time. It's curious to see that Google Maps updated satellite imagery in this direction, showing the degree of destruction to the that the town has suffered in these almost 2 years of positional battles. Interesting there, we can go down and see shelling, destruction. I guess, yeah, look at that. It's interesting. I hadn't noticed that. I haven't looked at this area of the map for some time, but Google Maps has updated it, and you can see huge amounts of destruction to that facility as well as to the town itself. But yes, the Ukrainians appear to be in control of that. Now, whether that's a counterattack that's happened recently or whether that's been the case for some time and evidence has just come out, I don't know. I would assume then that you'll see Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Maps catch up with this change in the mapping, but that's certainly good news for the Ukrainians in that area. On the other hand, the Russians appear to be gaining, as according to Surat Maps and Andrew Perpetua, around the Vasily area here, moving up, oh, not Vasily, between Vasily and Berestova, moving up the railway track further into Ukrainian territory. There's some interesting topography around here where the ground is not just completely flat like it is down south. There are these sort of ravines and rivers that mean that it's all a little bit up and down. And that either side will be gaining advantage or disadvantage in certain areas. Here, for example, the Russians are trying to attack up the hill there, and that means it's going to be a little bit more challenging for them. The Ukrainians might have some degree of advantage there. But anyway, that is possibly some gains for the Russians. So a mixed bag of what's been taking place in the Siversk front line. And when we look at Bakhmut, we can see no changes to the front line, which is really good news. The ISW does say, and this is in reference to the gains that the Russians made to the south of Ivanivska here, that all the mappers agree is under Russian control. And then to the north as well, success for the Russians there. Geolocated footage published on the 2nd shows that Russian forces recently advanced into southwestern Ivanivska, and Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces advanced further west of Ivanivska towards Chasiv Yar. But ISW has not observed visual confirmation of those claims, although it says geolocated footage. I think it means particularly of the last claims towards Chasiv Yar. So that might be that geolocated footage exists to support Ivanivska, the attack there, but not so much up here. Although I presume there must be some geolocated footage, otherwise these mappers wouldn't have moved their maps, or particularly if they're all in agreement there. Russian sources discuss this. That's why ISW has not observed. Doesn't mean there isn't any, it just means that they have not observed it, so they've not come across it. Russian sources discuss the struggles that Russian forces are facing in their effort to seize Chasiv Yar. A Russian mill blogger complained that Russian infantry largely have to conduct dismounted infantry assaults west of Bakhmut despite heavy Ukrainian drone operations, and that some Russian infantry only train for a week and a half before deploying to Bakhmut, contributing to significant Russian losses. The mill blogger claimed that some infantry must operate on foot for several days and that these prolonged dismounted operations also generate large losses. Other mill bloggers forecasted that dense Ukrainian minefields, defense in depth, and prepared indirect fighting positions in and near Chasiv Yar will likely present significant challenges to the Russian effort to seize the town. This is what I've been saying previously, is that Chasiv Yar should be fairly well defended, given how long the Ukrainians have had to dig in there, and the topography of that whole area is also pretty challenging for a frontal assault there. So, yeah, good news for the Ukrainians that the Russians are having challenges, that they aren't particularly well trained, and they're using predominantly dismounted infantry, so not so much use of mechanized equipment, which is always the case around Bakhmut. When the Wagner forces took Bakhmut, they did so predominantly with meat assaults. They didn't use a lot of mechanized equipment in Bakhmut. Very rarely did we see infantry fighting vehicles and the like operating there. Anyway, moving further to the south, although there is... Oh yeah, that was just a claim around Berestova, but we've kind of gone through that. Yeah, it's interesting that... Oh no, we've gone through that. That's fine. Let's move further now to the south to Bakhmut, and we can see that there's a slight change according to Deep State Map in the Bedichi area, but no one agreeing with the Surat Map's claim of the Russians across the river in Bedichi, or indeed across the river around Semenivka or Livka area, which I think is significant. If these two claims are true, then the Ukrainians are in a bit of trouble because their defensive line and their natural barrier there has been broken. We'll wait to see whether that has happened, and even if some Russian troops do get across there, the real issue is whether the Russians can get mechanized equipment across the Derna River and then up onto the higher ground. I guess we'll have to wait and see. As we come further to the south, you can see that both mappers, well, I say both, Andrew Perpetua and Surat Maps, agree that the Russians are making gains north of Pervomaisky, north of Perekrestok, and therefore slightly towards Natailove, but also north into these fields between the two watercourses of Pervomaisky and then Umanska up here. So trying to fill in with red, if you like, this open area. Surat Maps says of there that during the last few hours, the Russian army has made new advances north and west of Vodyane. That, if you remember, it was Opitny and Vodyane that we were talking about for so long. That seems to be a different era now. And then we have the Institute for the Study of War saying that Russian forces reportedly advanced west of Avdiivka amid continued fighting in the area on the 3rd. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces advanced up to 1.5 kilometers in width and depth towards the Umansky-Netailove line in recent days. So that's in this area. So basically they've advanced, which we have seen. That seems to have been borne out over recent days, as it says. Another mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from Bedichi and Semenivka, but while ISW has not observed confirmation of this claim, they currently assess that Russian forces occupy most of Bedichi. You would expect that to happen. That's not like all that bad that the Ukrainians would, particularly Bedichi, where it's that side of the river. But it is the source of the river, so you'd want the Ukrainians to put up some resistance here, because otherwise the Russians can get round to the north, and Semenivka is on the other side of the river. So it depends what you mean by control of Semenivka or pulling out of there. You would want the Ukrainians really to control the village, but the land outside it's not so important. So anywhere to the east of the river, you would expect the Ukrainians to eventually cede to the Russians and encamp themselves to the west of the river on the higher ground. Right. That is the lot for the Avdiivka area. So we're going to move slightly to the south now, come past Krasnohorivka, where yet again no changes to the mapping there. Really good news for the Ukrainians, and Marinka too, and Pobieda, and we see some gains south of Novomykhailivka. So this is very worrying, I'd say. If the Russians can continue advancing towards the road connecting Vuhledar to Konstantinivka and eventually take Konstantinivka, it could be that, as we've seen a number of times, the Russians are realizing that it's too difficult to go through a town, so they try and flank it, and then sometimes they find that so difficult, and they eventually go through the town. It depends how much aviation they can bring to bear. What do we have for other sources? Novomykhailivka. So Ukrainian. So this is going back to the Institute for the Study of War. That says geolocated footage published on April the 3rd shows that Russian forces marginally advanced near a windbreak southwest of Novomykhailivka. So that could well be here. That's the windbreak, I think. That's what Andrew Perpetua had as Russian control, and that could be based on this, which is a Ukrainian tank approaching and firing on a Russian position. So the question is this the Ukrainian tank coordinates, or is it the Russian position? So that could be okay. So that could be a typical Surat Maps one. I was expecting that to be further up there. I presume that isn't the tank firing on those positions up there. It could be interesting. I'd need to look into that a little bit more. Ukrainian tank approaching and firing on Russian positions in the area south of Paraskovivka. It's going to be a little bit too difficult Yeah, that does seem to be that windbreak. Yeah, there it is. So something's going on here. So I presume then the Russians are in that windbreak and the Ukrainians are firing on it. So that's why Surat Maps has changed that to be Russian control. The question is, as ever, how consolidated is that control? Is that they've just reached that windbreak and the Ukrainians have attacked them with a tank and have repelled that attack, repelled the Russians there, or do the Russians hold that solidly despite attacks from Ukrainian tanks? So anyway, that's Surat Maps' change. We'll see whether the other mappers agree that confirms a consolidated control of that area, of that windbreak, that tree line. And then no changes to the southern front line. It seems to be fairly positional, fairly quiet in comparison to some of the other hot points along the front line. Indeed, the ISW confirming that marginal advances, but generally positional fighting around Velika Novosilka and positional fighting around Robotina as well. We get on to Krimki, so we come to the west and go to the Dnipro River here. We have the bridgehead that the Ukrainians have on the other side of the Dnipro and Konka rivers there, and also at the Antonivsky Bridge. That gets a mention as well today in the ISW report. It says that Ukraine's Southern Operational Command reported that Russian forces have somewhat changed their assault tactics on the east bank of Kherson, and are conducting a larger number of assaults with smaller groups. So not really throwing too much stuff at any one time at these bridgeheads, because we've seen recently that they have, or over the last few months really, or 6 months, that the Ukrainians have caused the Russians to lose an awful lot of equipment in this general area as they try and dislodge the Ukrainians from the left bank of the Dnipro. But it continues to say that a Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces maintained limited positions near the Antonovsky roadway bridge. So if you remember, there's two bridges down here. You've got the road bridge that goes across into Dachi, and apparently the Ukrainians are still active there, and you've got the railway bridge over here. I don't know whether the Ukrainians are active there at all, but that's interesting. There's still activity around the Antonivsky Bridge. Anyway, there you go. That's the Frontline update for you today. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all your support. Thank you so much for your continued support, and for all the members who are so kindly helping this channel to keep producing the content for you. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.